Hi, and welcome to Writer's Ramble. I'm Deanna,
And I'm Michael.
and today we're going to talk about how we've changed as writers.
So, Deanna and I have been writers for the better parts of our lives now. I'm currently 23,
And I'm 24.
and I think I've been writing since like late elementary. I can't remember exactly, honestly. Um, Now, that's not to say that my first story was good, but I did write.
Yeah, I always thought for the longest time that I wrote or that I started writing around 6, but I actually found like my first ever notebook filled with short stories, like the first stories I ever wrote, and as you can imagine, they were not great. But it looks like because I had the date on there, and I think I was about 8. So all these years I've been telling people that I started writing at 6, and I'm such a freaking phony, I guess. It's actually, I was 8 when I started.
Even if you started writing when you were 8, I mean, I was probably like at least 11.
Loser. Not a real writer.
Oh, you're right. I should just go kill myself, I think.
Yeah.
But I suppose our first stories are a good place to start. Between the two of us, we'll just really quick recount what our very first things we can remember writing were, what they were like, and we can just kind of like briefly touch on like major things we've written since and see, you know, how we've done.
I mean, I don't know about you. I'm not gonna go into like all the, history of what
I
exact.
said briefly, you know.
Yeah, well, I wasn't gonna go, terribly in depth of what I was writing because some of it you guys already know about if you're following story time. You got a pretty good idea. And that wasn't even like my first story, so I mean, there's stuff before it that were even worse. So there's always room for improvement, and that's the beauty of writing. It's also a curse, but what can you do?
Get published hopefully one day.
Yeah. It is kind of funny though because like you could successfully publish something, it could be well received, but like no matter what, whether it be 5 years down the road or 20 years down the road, you might look at it and be like, "Ooh, yeah."
Yeah, I actually watched it was like a different YouTube video talking about writing stuff, and it was like an actually published author that was like on this thing, and she said like yeah, like the very first thing that I got published, I like it's trash in comparison to what I'm writing now, and what I'm writing now will probably be trash to what I will be writing in 3 years.
But that's okay. In the writing community, we are all suffering. We're not happy. It's we're all
Life is pain.
we're in this together, guys.
Yeah, solidarity in our eternal search for being better and never quite attaining perfection and wanting to, probably die.
But that's what makes you a writer. Congratulations. Get yourself a customizable mug that we will one day sell from our channel that says something.
Channel your pain, put it into your art. People will eat that crap up. Although, I actually did see a thing that was talking about, like, do depressed artists make better art? No. No, you just make sadder art, which can seem deeper. But, like, there's no excuse for making yourself mentally ill. If you already are and you make good art, I guess cool, but, like, you should probably not want to be sad.
Maybe I want to be Vincent van Gogh drinking yellow paint.
You do you, but personally, I'm going to try to maintain my mental health. Anyway, let's try to get started and get into the nitty gritty of our first stories. Do you want to start or should I?
You can go ahead.
All right, so my first story, let me give you a brief synopsis. Um, there is a guy.
Wow.
He gets chased by this evil monster thing through his house. It looks like a person, but like he's grinning from ear to ear, very scary. I remember drawing stick figures to represent this in the story. I was very smart and very creative. um,
I mean, I would be scared if I was being chased by a guy that was like grinning at me.
you know what? Like even to this day, I think that the premise isn't terrible. Like he eventually the main character, I don't remember the name even. I don't think I gave him a name. It was in first person, so like I just kept saying I. Um, but like so like the kid like runs away from his house because like the monster's chasing him all throughout his house. He ends up in a cave, and in the cave are these crystals, and somehow or other, I don't even know how I like expositioned this, but you find out that like the monster is like a crystal shape shifting monster that wants this character dead for reasons that I have no idea. Um, and so like I started the story, I never finished it because I've not finished most anything I've ever written. Not to say that I never will, but like,
Join the club.
but yeah, that's probably most of us anyway. Um, I had plans though. Like there was gonna be a whole thing where he like gets saved from the cave. Well, actually, I think I did write this. So he gets saved from the cave by like finding or not finding. Someone found him. They were underground in this like tunnel thing, and like they popped up from the ground, and they're like, "Hey, follow us." And so like the main character follows them down and like escapes the guy who had like cornered him in the cave, and underground is this like resistance, even though for all intents and purposes 20 minutes ago everything was fine and normal in the world. But anyway, like he so, I had plans like this was so long ago. I'm sorry if I keep like changing things and like misremembering. It's been so long.
It's already very riveting for a child story.
Anyway, there's this resistance, and like the main things I remember is that I wanted there to be a big battle at one point with like this giant mech that my character was in, and like somehow or other, once he like goes through this battle, he would end up on like the alien mothership. I guess they were crystal aliens, and like he was gonna blow up the mothership, and it was gonna be a whole thing. I probably wrote 2 chapters and then stopped, and the chapters were like a page long. so,
So it be.
so yeah, like as like for a start, premise wise, I think it's not terrible, but like as an actual story, I have much improved since then. Again, I wrote like a page for each chapter, and here's the weird part for me, especially now having written like a full book. I didn't know at the time, and I didn't know for a long time, honestly, how to make a story very long. You have had the opposite problem, but like I have always struggled with like actually being patient enough, I guess, and also having like the enough ideas to make a story lengthy. I excel at writing short stories. I have never been that great at like making something particularly long. Even my current story, I feel like even though it is novel length, um, it might be kind of packed because I typically write things in a shorter form manner than other stories might because I felt like I had to. Here's a weird thing when you're first starting out writing. Everything that you write is going to feel a lot longer than what it actually is going to read as. Because guess what? It takes a lot longer to write a scene, to write a chapter, than it is to read it. I know that that's like pretty obvious, but like you don't feel that when you're first starting out, or if you're young, just generally. So like if it took you a day to write 3 pages, you're gonna be like, wow, I got so much written. And here's the thing: a human being, especially one who like can read at a decent speed, could finish those 3 pages in like 20 minutes, maybe even less. Probably like 5 minutes. I don't know. I'm not thinking actually.
Are you talking about reading it?
Yeah, reading is actually probably way less than 20
I
minutes. I don't know why I threw that out there.
it's like
Shut up.
it's like dang, you didn't do too good in school, did you?
No, I actually read very fast. I guess I
Because
was just like, I was just trying to like make it seem longer for the sake of like having it be comparable. Anyway,
wait,
anyway,
I just wanted to say because like I think I read a page, and I'm not talking about textbooks because that's a whole other animal in itself, but Just like, if I'm reading a book for fun, I think I read a page in about a minute.
Yeah, so like
So it's
probably
like,
more like 3 to 5 minutes,
yeah. If it's 20 minutes, you might have fallen asleep.
or you might just be a slow reader. I'm not judging. Anyway, so like if you do end up wanting to write something that's like a full length, um, be prepared to take a lot longer to write it than you would something shorter, and that's obvious. But like you got to really kind of keep in mind you're gonna have to be patient with this, which is something that I kind of struggled with, and I still do to an extent. What about you?
Well, in my case, like I started off writing short stories, and as I think I might have mentioned before, what we're reading was Storytime, The Darkness. That was like my first attempt of doing a novel, which I think I did pretty good at that age, even though it's, not written great, but for the age, it was like a really ambitious project for me. But then around that age, I kind of reversed entirely, and then I was just writing way, way too much. And it's funny because like that continued all the way up through high school, and I had a teacher, and he was a nice guy, but he was like trying to encourage me to write more concisely, and I was just like, no. And I think I was kind of sitting up on a high horse because I had stories on fan fiction, and at least on there it
That
was.
makes me smarter than you, teacher who is probably 20 years older than me.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, I was kind of, it was getting to my head because, I had like followers on there, so I was kind of like, oh, well, if you're talking about fan fiction, I'm kind of famous, so they like my wordiness. But I look back on it now and it's just ridiculous. And I actually have a little example here that I'd like to share. And
This is probably my favorite bit that I've read from the initial story.
so I'd like to first give the disclaimer that I was writing Phantom of the Opera fan fictions, and to be honest, I still am because I'm rewriting my shithole of a story.
You know,
And
I I think if I remember correctly, I want to say that you didn't edit these a ton.
it's funny. Like I would skim over it when I was proofreading, but skimming is
It's not the
not.
same.
No, it's not good enough. If you're doing that, please, please, like actually proofread because what I do now, or at least the last time I was regularly updating to fan fiction, I would read my whole chapter at least 4 to 6 times very carefully, and that's probably not even enough, but
Yeah, I was gonna say you at least want to like read the thing twice. And then like it's not even a bad idea to put it down and come back another time and reread it again because especially if you've just written it and you're reading through, like you can edit as you go and then you can like go back one more time and just make sure everything is the way you wanted to write it. But the benefit of coming back another day or just like maybe later in the day is like if you reread it again at that point, you might realize because you're not as close to it anymore as when you were writing it, you can be like, oh, maybe this isn't even what I want to say exactly anyway. Like I've done that several times, like where I've written a chapter and I come back like a couple months later and I'll read it and I'll just be like, yeah, I can change a lot of stuff here. You can never make it perfect. Don't try to like over edit it. That can be something that people fall into as well as under editing, but like you definitely don't want to just like write it without even thinking once you're done and being like post.
yeah, because I have over edited something, and that actually happened for an English paper, and I got a poor grade on it, and they were like, yeah, this part just didn't make sense, you just transitioned here, and I didn't understand. I was like, I was trying to be concise, but yeah, there's such thing as over editing. But, anyways, as for this lovely example that I'm gonna show you, it's a perfect example of my wordiness at the time. It's like a good paragraph long, and I'm not even gonna quite read the entire thing because there's some dialogue, so I'm gonna just skip to. I'll give a tiny bit of context here. So, since it's a Phantom of the Opera story, one of the main characters is Eric, which is the Phantom, and I was basically just describing that he was very angrily staring someone down, but of course I had to stretch it out to an entire paragraph, so here's what it said. I watched as his eyes grew utterly furious as they locked on Carlotta. He stared her down like he was a cat monitoring a mouse. I could see the hatred in his eyes. If looks could kill, Carlotta would have been dead by then. Eric looked like he wanted to strangle Carlotta right then and there. He glared at her as though he was waiting for her to burst into flames. His face was straight and his burning blue eyes were refusing to flinch away from Carlotta. He looked determined that she would pay. Some people say that hate is a strong word, but looking into Eric's eyes, I didn't doubt that utter hatred filled them. What I saw in his eyes was certainly hatred.
I okay, so I've never been a wordy one like I described a second ago. I don't know how you can sit there and write all of those and like not pick like two or three of them to go with. Instead, you just shoved all of them in there. Like, what was your thought process?
It was like I could think of multiple ways to describe it, and I was like, I'll just throw all of them in there, which is bad advice in case you didn't know, because
I think the results speak for themselves.
yeah, just reading it, I feel like I'm gonna have an aneurysm because it's just very tedious, and I feel bad for people that were reading my story at the time. And it's funny because the fan fiction was like really well received, so I've kind of come with this conclusion that I think my readers might have been very young because I don't know if anyone older would have really tolerated this wordiness. I'm not sure. I mean, my followers were very lovely and sweet, and I'm very thankful for that, but it's stuff like this, the reason why I wanted to just rewrite my whole series, and it's actually, I think I'm about halfway through my story, and it's only like a third of the size so far.
Well, you said, well, you wrote it when you were like,
I was 14.
preteen, teen, 14? Okay,
Yeah.
teen. Um, and like my personal theory is, you probably just attracted naturally those of a similar age. Um, Hormones be crazy, y'all. And when you are 13, 14, 15, um,
You just throw shit on paper.
you think you're so smart, like you ever heard of, the like subreddit r/I'm 13 and this is deep. You think you're so smart, you think you got everything figured out, or at the very least you are getting what I think it is you're like getting the first inklings of deeper thoughts. And so therefore, like, because you're, I wouldn't say excited about it because it's new to you though.
I mean, I was.
Everything everything that's like um these deep feelings, right? Like sadness or hatred and stuff like that. These deep, like visceral feelings that you're just starting to feel, especially because of the hormones. You just want to write it all down, and people who are going through the same thing, they'll be like, "Yeah." It doesn't make it good writing, but like, that's my theory as to why you had such support in your audience and why they were like all right with you being incredibly, how I would put it, dramatic.
Yeah, and it's funny because I didn't view it really as dramatic. I think I viewed it as passionate, which, it's in a.
Go hand in hand.
Yeah, it really is kind of the same thing, but different angles when you look at it. But it kind of reminds me, like even in high school, like being like 14, 15, and we'd have an assignment where we'd have to write like maybe a poem or whatever. And I've found every once in a while I'll come across something that I would have submitted, and and I just laugh as I read it because it's like really super edgy and emo. And I didn't like think I was at that age, but hindsight's 2020. You like look back on it later and you're like, "Oh my gosh, yeah, no. That was definitely way too dramatic." And it kind of reminds me of something. So, I did this a little bit more so I think like when I was in middle school, but I would say something you should probably steer away from. Like, don't use too many exclamation points or typing in all caps because
Yeah. That's actually something. Well, not that specifically, but well, actually, some of that specifically. That's something that I not most, slightly more recently have actually gotten better at. Um, the story that I have written is fully written. I'm just editing it still. And it's gonna be a while actually to edit it because it took me like I think 3 or 4 years to actually fully write it out. And in that time, I've gotten better, and now I'm going through all of my old chapters again, and like I finally like admitted to myself that like it's probably not good looking in an officially written thing to have like a question mark and then like an exclamation point or like a couple exclamation points together. Um, Editors don't want that. Uh, the readers probably don't want that. I was just it made sense in my mind, and like it also makes sense in like comic books and stuff, but like those aren't supposed to be grammatically perfect or you know punctuation perfect. So like recently I've had to go through old chapters and like delete anytime I do something like that, I'll just change it to like a question mark or just a single exclamation point, or like if it is in all caps, which I did do a couple of times, I'll delete it and make it not all caps. And like I cringe a little bit thinking about it now, and it really was not that long ago.
It is funny, like how much you can change as a writer over such a short period of time. And I'm so sorry, guys, if you hear a vacuum in the background, because apparently we live with someone who decided to just start vacuuming now. But let's give it a moment, shall we? I actually do find it pretty funny. Whenever I see someone's story or whatever, and it like something like maybe someone's yelling, it's like in all caps. I find it like kind of hilarious. Actually, it just feels kind of dramatic, and so yeah.
Feels
Please,
like they're yelling at the top of their lungs.
yeah. So maybe steer far away from that. What I do if I have a character that's like maybe like and this is used very sparingly. Like if they're screaming, I might put something in italics, which I'm not even sure if that's really a good thing. I might later be like, oh no.
I think that italics is fine. I've seen it in like real published stories before, so I think that's fine.
Yeah, I feel like that's a more appropriate thing to go with. But I also wanted to include, we both actually proofread each other's stories, and I feel like we've both seen each other improve just as we've been critiquing each other's work. And something that I think you're maybe planning on mentioning, I helped you realize the placement of commas with the word but.
It was a hard conclusion for whatever reason for me to come to, but and then there would be a comma there. You are supposed to put commas before but and. It's contextual. It's not always going to be the case. Um,
Yeah, there's always exceptions, but if it's a longer sentence and you have and or but, it should really go before that word.
See, I was going off the logic that you only put a comma where you would naturally have a break in the sentence. And I feel like if you are saying a sentence out loud, I stopped.
The return of the killer vacuum.
How cats and dogs think. What was I saying?
The placement of commas.
Yeah, so I feel like um, there are some sentences where you might say but or and you're not necessarily going to pause before you say but and. Like, I'm going to the grocery store, but blah 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 blah. And it doesn't feel like there needs to be a break there when you're like saying it out loud. Um, but like oftentimes you will break before you say but or and also it is just grammatically correct. I fought with that one for a long time, and eventually I just gave in. And now, because I've done that so late into writing my story, I have to go back when every instance of the word but and I have to add a freaking comma. in my story because I was so stubborn. So don't be like me, kids. Put a comma before but and. Your editor, if you ever get one, will appreciate it. Anyone else who reads your story will appreciate it. It'll go over better. It'll look better.
And I mean, I'm not like a professional editor or anything, and I believe if the sentence is short enough, you don't need it, but it's especially if it's a longer sentence. And I think what was driving me crazy, especially when I was critiquing your work, is that you were putting like you'd have a comma there, but you had a after and or but, and that one really drove me up
Well,
the wall.
I did that at one point because it made more sense. Like eventually, at first I wasn't doing commas at all before or after but and. Um, but then like we talked about it, and I was like, it makes sense to actually put it after the but, and
And I was
that
like, I have never seen that before in my life.
yeah, that was a mistake. I'll admit. But I fixed it now. I've gotten better.
Improvement.
Yeah, and that's the name of the game here. Speaking of which, I'm just gonna real quick like lightning round talk about some of the other things I've written since. Honestly, most of them are like short stories, and you can just kind of assume that they're middling to kind of bad depending on when I've written it. Because like I had a lot of short stories. I had an idea about like this guy who like lives in this village and they live up in these super tall trees and like that was kind of a neat idea to me and like he was trying to climb this like impossible to climb mountain and that was like a whole thing. There'd be like a shrine at the top. You'd learn how to become a kung fu master. I don't know where I was really going with it. It was just a neat premise. And I also wanted it to be like choose your own adventure, which those are harder to write than you'd think. I gave up on that pretty quick. Um,
You're like, nah.
yeah, if you're gonna write one of those, I think you really need an outline.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But anyway, uh, and then there's another one which I did actually finish this one. It was still a short story though. It was for a class. We were all told to kind of just do something we were passionate about, I believe, and it was an English class, so I wrote a story. Um, it was about this this whole. It's been a while. It's about like this kind of conspiracy about the moon. I don't want to really get too far into it because it'd be a lot to explain, but it involves like everyone finding out that real life is on the moon and there are aliens and like a place gets blown up at the end. And I cringe kind of thinking about it because I presented in front of class, and that's like one of the few times in my life I've been in front of people and I read something and my voice broke a lot, and like I didn't think it would happen, but it did happen, and I felt bad, and like it was 30 pages, and I read all of them in front of the class, and like by the end of it, I was really regretting my decision. But you know, I'm not necessarily regretful that I did it. It was just kind of a an awkward experience. I feel bad for the people who had to listen to me because I sat there for a long time just reading out loud. Um, anyway, so there was that, and then finally, pretty shortly after that, I started writing the story that I'm still editing now, that I recently finished, and that's the one I've been solely focused on since then, which I think is a good idea if you're ever writing a book or a story. Try to limit it to as few as you can without getting distracted by other ideas and having 17 unfinished works in progress on your hand.
Don't do what I've done, kids, and falling into that trap, which I learned my lesson at one point, but apparently not well enough. Because when I was in middle school, I was juggling like three or four different stories, and looking back on them, because I had like one main project that I was working on, which was the sequel to The Darkness, and then I started writing, I think, two other stories, and at the most, I think I had like 14 pages or something in each one. So that's usually what happens. And the last 10 years or so, I've done pretty good about focusing on just like one story at a time. But I've made the mistake of becoming interested in more than one story. So now I have multiple stories that I'm writing, and that's not good. and I pray for the progress of my stories because I don't want to abandon any of them, but it can be really difficult if you have inspiration for something else. And I think I originally went into it like, um, you know, if I'm experiencing a little bit of writer's block with one, but I am having inspiration for something else, I might just like write a scene and then just kind of tuck it away somewhere, and then I'll go to that, I'll return to it later. And it started off that way, and now I'm like 65 pages into this story, and I'm like, well, shit.
Yeah, I do want to say if you have an idea that you think is better than the one you're currently working on, or if you just feel like you have to write down some of it, I'd say go for it. And if that ends up becoming the main one that you work on, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a terrible thing to switch if it feels better to work on that one mainly than the other one that you might have been working on mainly before. Um, no, there's no rules to this. There's no laws. If you genuinely feel like what you have in mind is better than what you had been writing, and it'll do better, and you have more inspiration for it, etc., etc., go for it. I'd say, but at least sit back and think about it before you start doing something like that. Because again, if you have 9 different things that you want to write and you've written like 3 pages in all of them, you're probably not going to finish most of them, and it'll be very hard to focus on one over the others, which is kind of something that has to happen in order to get something finished most of the time.
Yeah, and I mean, it is possible to like outgrow a story that you were writing because that's what happened to me with my series of, The Adventures of Samantha, because I was becoming a teenager at that point, and granted, the next thing I produced, looking back, is not good, as, I read an example earlier, but I kind of feel like it was natural that I ended up just sort of abandoning The Adventures of Samantha because that was like old news, and what I was going for was a little bit too silly and childish for me at that point.
Very
And
derivative of Zelda, apparently.
yeah. And so I kind of feel like in some ways it can be beneficial to just kind of abandon certain projects. Not saying you should always do this, but if you have no interest in writing it anymore and it's starting to ruin your life because you want the story to just be finished with, maybe consider if that's worth it.
Yeah, most of these things are contextual. You either will find it worth it or won't find it worth it to start something new, abandon something old, or stick with it. You got to figure that out for yourself, but just generally speaking, it's good to try to stick with something and only change it if you really feel like it's a good idea to. Real quick, before we wrap everything up, I don't want, why don't you um, tell us like how you're doing now, what you're writing now, and just like things you might feel you've gotten better at recently.
Um, I will say that I feel like I've gotten a lot better with being more concise with my descriptions, which I never thought I was going to say, and I originally was very opposed to the idea of simplifying, which my teacher was trying really hard to beat into my head, and I was just not budging on it at the time. But now, being older, I can say, yeah, he had a point. I'm mature enough to say that now, but it's kind of funny because I went through a period where I was kind of wrestling with what my voice was with like my writing style. I felt like I was regressing, but in actuality, it was kind of like growing pains. Like I was getting better, but I didn't necessarily realize it. I thought I was just doing worse. But looking at the overall flow of my stories now, I feel a lot more confident that I actually just improved, but I didn't feel like it at the time. But if I'm thinking about things I've been writing lately, which again, I've done the bad thing where I have multiple works in progress, so shame on me.
At least you've been mainly working on the rewritten version of your first story instead of switching back and forth and dividing your attention all the time.
Yeah, because there's two different things I'm currently kind of focusing on, and one of them is more of like a guilty pleasure story for me. But I was originally on the third and final story of my series that is a Phantom of the Opera fan fiction, which I know is really cringy to hear for a lot of writers, but for fan fiction writers out there, I see you and I love you. Kiss, kiss. And,
Mwah, mwah.
keep at it. Um, Anyways, I was on the third story and I realized, I think around that period, I was looking back on my first story and, really cringing because I remembered that I was 14 when I started those. And so I was like, nope, 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 this has all got to change. And I also, around that time, was taking a certain psychology class that was really, it was giving me a lot of inspiration. I was getting all sorts of plot bunnies, and so it made me just want to rewrite essentially my entire series, which is really stressful because I started this series like a decade ago, and I don't want to necessarily keep writing for another decade because I have other projects that I want to focus on. So, the good news is I'm about halfway through the first story, and I got through it decently fast, so, that's good. And I think as I go further in, there might be less that I'll have to edit, but you never know. Because by the time I finally catch up to the second and third one, I might be looking at what I originally had and wanting to throw up, maybe. But I've also kind of my secondary project at the moment that I'm writing as I'm also writing the revamped version of my fan fiction. I never thought I would have done anything like this, but I actually started an autobiography, which feels really conceited to say. I don't want to be one of those snobby writers that's like, oh, I'm such a interesting, fascinating, unique snowflake, because that's not really what I'm going for. I just feel like the last 10 years of my life, I've grown close to certain people that have really changed my life, and I think I kind of want it to be sort of a coming of age type story. Like, I really enjoyed Little Women growing up, different genre, but also a coming of age story. I love The Catcher in the Rye, but that's like a very negative tone.
Yeah.
Which I'm not necessarily going for that in particular, but I do like those coming of age stories.
It's honestly really good, guys. Like I've read a fair bit of it, and I think that you actually do pretty good at slice of life type stuff and realistic, but sort of like um, moralistic type stories where it's like there's like a point to it, and like it's just life, yo. Kind of makes me think a little bit, not exactly because very different style, but like How I Met Your Mother tends to have like life lessons and stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, and we watched that together, so that's why that's why I'm thinking of it now. Um,
It did actually come to mind while I was writing it, but thank you.
hmm so if I were to leave this episode with a moral lesson, I would say that you're always getting better, and even if you look back at your old stuff and you cringe, uh, that just means that you've grown a lot. And you'll never make your story perfect, but you can make it better, and you're always moving forward. So, like if you sit back and you look at some of the stuff you've written from a long time ago, you're gonna want to rewrite everything, but you're gonna do the same thing if you write something now and you look back at it later. So it's important to always try to continue moving forward. Still try to get it published, even if you're not sure about it. Still, try to make something of it, even if it isn't perfect. Sometimes readers will get the gist of what you mean without having to execute it 100% perfectly. Um,
You also really you can't strive for perfection because there is no such thing as a perfect story. There's always, no matter what, it's gonna be picked apart by readers, and they'll inevitably find some little nugget of, you know, um, shit.
and ultimately, it's better that you would have it out there than not having it at all.
I do have one other story in mind, and I've only written a chapter or two, and so far I've done a good job at not hugely diving into this, but rather I've just been composing notes, like ideas that I have for this, doing a lot of story building or world building rather. And
Brainstorming.
yeah, a lot of brainstorming. And it's different from other stories that I've written, a very different genre, because I haven't really done too many sci fi things, but what I've had in mind is like a genetic engineering story, and because I'm also a romance, or a romantic rather, there's gonna be some romance in it, but I don't have a whole lot to say about it at this point in time, but it's just something that I have in mind that I'm excited, and I can tell it's gonna be a pretty ambitious project when I do finally get started on it, but in the meanwhile, I'm just compiling a whole bunch of notes.
So, with all of that being said, I've been Michael,
And I've been Deanna.
and this has been Writer's Ramble. Tune in next week to hear us talk about um,
Something.
the deep, intricate, impossible to understand lore of Elden Ring because I'm definitely gonna do that, and I'm definitely gonna know exactly what I'm talking about. And this is definitely an episode that's actually going to come out. Parentheses, probably not. Just I needed something to say.
Good job.
I've been playing it a lot recently. It's on the brain. Bye.
Bye.